Good afternoon and welcome to JS on Politics, our weekly look at what's happening in Madison and beyond. I'm your host, Greg Borowski, and we have a very full agenda today. We're going to dig in on how the budget changes will affect state schools, both public and private. We'll preview today's action in Madison, which includes a discussion of a certain troubled state jobs agency. And Mr. Walker goes to Washington. How is the governor faring in his bid to lock up conservative voters? Plus, of course, reader questions. We're aiming to get quite a few of those today, but you can send in others with just the click of a button. Well, that and a little bit of typing. But we'll start with education. So joining me now are Aaron Richards, our education reporter, Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist. Last week when we were here, we were talking about the MPS turnaround plan, takeover plan. That's been revised this week in the budget, but it's there, so something is happening. Can you tell us, Aaron, about the changes and what's the impact here on MPS in particular?
Right. So two Republican lawmakers inserted a pretty large provision in the state budget that would essentially put into state law that there would be a commissioner appointed by Milwaukee County Executive Chris Abele that would control a select number of low-performing schools in Milwaukee. That's a big change from now because the school board wouldn't have any say about what would happen in those schools. The commissioner would control the buildings. There's still some question about how that sale would work because the city technically owns the buildings right now. At the same time, Milwaukee Public Schools is taking up their own plan tonight in a meeting to say, wait, let us do this. We'd rather work our own plan to give our own superintendent more authority over her own buildings. Essentially, they want to keep control of the buildings and they don't want someone else to take them over.
Is that sort of a genuine interest in this sort of reform, or is this, well, this bus is coming, let's try to steer it a little bit, in our direction?
Well, I think between negotiation and getting the hammer from somebody in Madison, you'd take negotiation. So I think this is a step to try to say, well, let us work with our own authority.
But the bigger question is, do the Republicans in Madison care what the MPS board is doing? They don't generally. They haven't in the past. So they'll probably end up doing what they want to do on this.
And I think the question is the action too little, too late?
All right, let's talk about some of the other changes in the budget. So the education piece is more or less set now by Joint Finance. You did a great story this morning, Aaron, on how it all played out. But who are the winners and losers here? Public schools got some of the money reinstated that Governor Walker had cut, but they don't seem to feel like they're big winners.
Depends on what side of the fence you're on. Public schools say, okay, we got a little bit of a bump in the second year of the budget. We're grateful that the funding cut was restored in year one, but you're sending a lot more of the finite pool of education funds to private schools by way of this statewide voucher expansion. So in the long run, public schools are saying this is the worst of the worst for us. We're going to have less money going forward, and we're going to have more kids on the public dime that weren't there before.
It's still not as bad as it could have been. I mean, had they taken Walker's proposal and gone with it, correct?
It could have been worse. I think it could always be worse. So yes, the restoration of the funding in the first year was a good thing for public schools in their eyes. At the same time, nobody saw the last minute insertion of a special needs voucher bill, which would also take $12,000 per kid. Should someone with a child with a special need take advantage of that option?
Senator Vukmir has been pushing that proposal for a long time. It's actually a model piece of legislation from ALEC that ends up getting inserted but not quite making it through. Do you think it'll get through this time?
I think it will. That's been a commitment. I mean, a lot of the Republicans behind the scenes said they really wanted this in there. It's failed twice when they introduced it as a standalone bill, mostly because people in the disability rights community were opposed to it. But I think this time they really wanted to get it in, and they did.
Explain the opposition a little bit, because on the one hand you hear people say that the voucher schools aren't as accepting, or they don't have to take the special needs students, and therefore that affects their test scores and performance and budgets. But here this says they would take them. So what's the opposition?
It's really about, from the Republican side, it's about parent choice. If you are a parent of a child with a disability, the belief is that you should be able to choose what school is best for your child. If that's not your home district and you've tried another public school in a different district, but maybe you've been denied because that district couldn't afford to serve you or didn't have a mechanism for serving you in a way that was best for both parties, this would give them another option to go to a private school instead. Critics say this is just one more maneuver to get more kids from public schools into private schools supported by taxpayers.
There's one other issue, one other criticism, and that's what happened in Florida with this, and that is when Jeb Bush was governor, they had a number of cases in which disabled children weren't weren't actually treated or helped when they were at the schools. They were often, there's video and news stories criticizing how the Florida schools, private schools, dealt with the handicapped children.
And as a matter of fact, there's one former voucher school in Wisconsin that actually sort of closed in the dead of night here and then ended up going down to Florida, very easily got into that special needs program and was serving a handful of kids.
And I think that's why you don't see Walker pushing this or getting anywhere near this, because of the potential negative fallout from this.
Yeah, let's do a little look ahead. So there are two more steps to the budget. One is, the full legislature has to finish its action, and then the governor gets it. So from your perspective, what's one thing on the education front that the full legislature is likely to change?
There's a provision for teacher licensing that would really lower the standards to become a teacher in Milwaukee, and I think that legislators will either take that up or Walker might address it in some way because of opposition.
Yeah. And Dan, for the governor, what do you think he's backs much of this, all of it, or will he sort of rewrite it?
Even though he's lost stuff in here, including the major cut, the $127 million cut to education, I don't see why. There's nothing in here that he can't, as a package, he can't not support in this deal. And he wants to get this budget through as quickly as possible because he has said he won't announce for president until the budget is signed. So if he ends up vetoing a number of provisions, then it goes back to the legislature and it slows down the whole process. So I don't think there's anything in here significant enough to make him decide to slow down the train for his presidential
let's
bid.
look at a couple. We had a lot of reader questions this week that related to education, and before Aaron departs on our show today, we wanted to get these in. The first one is the general one. Why is the perception so negative on public schools? What has changed in the past 15 years to drive this? Is the perception negative? Or is it just among certain lawmakers they think it's negative?
Well, I think if you talk to a lot of teachers in public schools, they'd say the climate is definitely kind of a low morale sort of place at the moment. You had Act 10, you've had a lot of criticism about stemming largely from the fact that unions were very powerful and reforms couldn't happen. The dynamic changed with Act 10, and now teachers really still feel like they're sort of being hammered.
But the Marquette poll showed that many voters still like their local public school, and that's why it's hard to make cuts to the budget for your local school if you're a local lawmaker.
All right, and let's throw in one other one here. There are several on the same theme, but this one relates to sort of the accountability question. It's from Nicolay fan, who asked, how can Darling and Republicans say they care about kids in Milwaukee when they do nothing to hold choice schools accountable? Is there anything new on the accountability front in here, or is it sort of the same system, just more schools and kids?
There's a provision in this education package that would call for an entity at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to look at some new assessments that could be used to have all publicly funded schools have some new measures to looking at growth over the course of the year. That's where really the conversation is moving. On the public school side, you hear people say, the more tests you get into the mix, the more you give everybody a choice, the less there's one single measure that we can look at all the schools by.
All right, there's more action in Madison today with the Joint Finance Committee, and in this tape segment, we'll get a preview of what's ahead today. We're joined now by Jason Stein, one of our Madison Bureau reporters, to give us a heads-up look at what's ahead today on the Joint Finance Committee's agenda. Jason, it's already been a busy week for the committee working over Governor Scott Walker's budget. Can you give us a sense of what to expect from the discussion today?
Yes, thanks, Greg. The Joint Finance Committee today will be looking at a whole host of agencies, including the Wisconsin Economic Development Corp. That's the state's flagship jobs agency, which has had some difficult headlines in recent days. As well, the committee will be looking at the State Government Accountability Board, which runs elections in Wisconsin. It'll be looking at Medicaid programs, which serve more than 1 million people in Wisconsin, from the elderly to young children. So it's going to be a very busy, packed day.
Let's talk a little bit, Jason. You mentioned WEDC, which is the jobs agency. This was created by Governor Walker and Republicans after the governor took over. It hasn't been a good week for them headline-wise, or really a good run from the beginning. There's been all sorts of audits with problems. Can you bring our viewers up to speed on where all of this stands now? It's certainly not an ideal situation for them.
The agency has struggled in recent years. It was created by Governor Walker and lawmakers in July 2011 to replace the State Department of Commerce, really one of the governor's signature policies. He's the chairman of the board, so he's very closely linked to the agency, which is tasked with growing the state economy, creating jobs, really key thing for any elected official. And they have had a number of issues raised in terms of the strength of their financial controls. They had an audit in May 2013. They had a follow-up audit earlier this month. Now, WEDC officials have disputed some of these findings, but what the nonpartisan auditors found was that the agency just did not always follow state law and its own policies in giving out taxpayer awards to private companies. And in addition, there's been another loan program that has also gotten a lot of attention in the news media in recent days.
Yeah, from your perspective, are these more accounting end things, or is it more fundamental in terms of questions about whether that agency is, and the changes that took place are truly effective or not?
I mean, it's a host of things. Some of them are more accounting, but again, when you have a situation where the state is not necessarily tracking, as it was in 2012 was a case of not tracking loans that taxpayers have made, that sort of accounting practice really matters. And then here more recently, we have this case where the state made an unsecured loan of $500,000 to a business that it turns out had been taken to court by the state for being delinquent in its taxes. So, and it turns out that $500,000 loan, which had no collateral attached, the company's now defunct. Taxpayers are so far out that money. So there are things like that really do speak to effectiveness as well as use of public dollars.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there, Jason. We appreciate the update, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, we're back live and joined now by Mary Spicuzza, a breaking news reporter for the Journal Sentinel and a longtime reporter at the Wisconsin State Journal. She's been writing about this issue, and of course, Dan Bice is still with us. Let's talk a little bit now that we've got the baseline of what's going on from Jason in that last segment. Where do we go from here? The governor's talked about making changes to the agency. What's prompting that?
I actually want to
happening?
move back and say, well, with Scott Walker, he's not talked about this very much, but when there is a controversy, you can always tell where he stands by how he responds to it before the story breaks. And in this case, he decided to get rid of, or propose getting rid of, the loan program at WEDC even before the first story ran. And as the State Journal pointed out in their story today, he made his announcement just an hour or so after they released the records on this proposal. So, I mean, this is a typical response from Walker. If he's got a controversial staffer, he knows the story is going to come out about it, he usually fires the person before the story runs. And in this case, his actions speak louder than his words. His decision to suspend the loan program indicates that he thinks this is a potential problem.
Okay. Well, this was a centerpiece of when Walker came into office. This was one of his major reforms about how to get government working more efficiently and really zoned in on jobs. We're hearing today that sort of the final numbers on his jobs promise, it was somewhere in the 129,000 range rather than 250,000. But do you have any thoughts, Mary, on how, I mean, where does this go now? The governor wants to make some changes, but what's the next step here?
You know, I don't know if the administration knows what the next step is. I feel like it has been very reactive, where a problem comes to light and so there's a reaction to that problem, then another comes up and there's a reaction. I don't know what the long-term vision for the WEDC is, and I don't know if Governor Walker knows. I feel like, obviously it was a centerpiece of his 2010 campaign. This was one of his first things, was to create this jobs agency, and it's really been struggling, and this last audit shows it's not getting better.
And Christian Schneider wrote a piece for the Journal Sentinel this week saying that we need to get rid of it altogether. Christian, a conservative, is making the case for that, and he's opposed to any sort of corporate welfare. But once again, it's a case where Walker's not speaking out on it, so you have Republicans going in different directions on what should be happening with this.
Well, it's certainly a case where this is our new model for Wisconsin, but other states have success with these programs, right? Yes? No? I mean, there's got to be some model that
They did
can
look
work.
at models in other states, but it was interesting because a lot of those models, when it was first being created, we looked at some of those models and some of them had very similar problems, especially in these quickly created, where it was just like, and even Governor Walker himself has said, looking back, maybe this should have been slowed down a little bit.
In Indiana, isn't that? That was a very similar situation. Governor Mitch Daniels had set up a similar entity, and there were news stories pointing out problems very similar to this.
All right, we're going to bring in Craig Gilbert, who's our Washington Bureau reporter now, and just get his take on this issue, mostly from the perspective of, when someone's running for president, you want to minimize all the distractions, and you don't want headlines about agencies that can't track where money's going and loans granted and all this other stuff. Craig, do you see any case where this will spill into the presidential race, or is it mostly a distraction? How do you think this plays with Walker as he pursues the presidential candidacy?
I think it's mostly a distraction at this point, but I think as just sort of a general proposition, I mean, everything that happens back home has the potential to kind of complicate his presidential campaign. I mean, as we speak right now, he's in Oklahoma City giving a speech. He's on the road a lot. He was in Washington earlier this week. He'll be in New Hampshire again soon. So he's a very attractive candidate to Republicans outside Wisconsin because of his political success in Wisconsin. So anything that kind of casts a cloud over that political success, I think is something he would not that he does not welcome and is not and would try to avoid. He's what he's trying to do is a difficult thing. He's trying to do two jobs at once.
But at the same time, it hasn't affected him. He's had issues since February where it's a two-track system. He's got his presidential race going on, and he has what's going on in Wisconsin. His presidential run has gone extremely well since he got in, or since he first started pursuing it. What's been going on here has not been going so well. And even this week, he's done a number of media interviews. He's talking about a wide range of issues, but none of them have to do with what's going on in Wisconsin.
Right.
He's talking
about you could argue that his running for president has had a more negative impact on his standing in Wisconsin than anything that's happened in Wisconsin has had on his run for president. I mean, it's still very early. And these things could end up having a cumulative effect, but I don't think any of them automatically and certainly not immediately translate into kind of baggage for him as a presidential candidate.
Let's talk a little bit and shift gears just ever so slightly into the broader presidential discussion. Now, earlier this week, Craig, Governor Walker was in Washington meeting with both a group of Republican members of Congress, and they had this meeting we talked about last week that involved leaders of conservative groups. How did he fare, do you think, in that little step toward wrapping up some support across the country?
Well, these meetings were all private, so we did get a chance. Reporters did get a chance to talk to some of these people on their way out of the meetings. I think that he had about 70 House Republicans, and most of the ones that were interviewed spoke very highly. They said they were impressed. They, nobody's endorsing him. It's very early. He's not even a declared candidate yet, but you get the feeling, not just in talking to Republican House members in Washington, but talking to Republican voters on the campaign trail, that because of what they know about him and his history in Wisconsin, he's somebody that people, would like to support. How that translates, 6 months from now into concrete support, will have a lot to do with how he performs on the campaign trail and what other information they get about him. But he's doing, as Dan said, he's doing well in this invisible primary process right now.
Because nobody in any of those meetings said to the governor, "What are you doing about Weedick?" It's just not something they care about. What they're asking him about is he solid on abortion? Is he solid on same-sex marriage? And they're going back to his history, to events from 2014, and asking him to clarify those things. But the discussion about what's going on in Wisconsin is not on any of those people's radar.
And I
That's
think when he
true,
was asked
but
about
I'm
it,
sorry, go ahead.
I think when he was asked about it, didn't he say he was the most scrutinized politician in America and kind of brush it off as like, people are after me again?
I think it's true that people aren't asking about these specifics, but when you think about the premise of his candidacy and his electability, which is that, all the things he accomplished, making a conservative agenda, somewhat politically popular in a tough swing state, I mean, those things, if his approval ratings continue to lag, and when people see the job numbers, those are things that all complicate that message. So I think the potential is there for some of this to be a drag down the road on his candidacy, but I think by any measure, he's doing really, really well in the early phases of this presidential campaign.
Well, when I saw that comment from the governor that Mary just mentioned about I'm the most scrutinized politician in America, I guess I wanted to say you're welcome, because we're busily scrutinizing him, but that's only going to get worse and more intense, but including not just from reporters, but people who would otherwise support him. So there were differing takes in the media last night about how his meeting with these conservative political leaders went, as some thought he clarified the comments or walked back comments on abortion and so forth.
Well, there is a push by some on the far right and some social conservatives, and there's some skepticism about him because of the fact that he didn't make abortion and same-sex marriage the centerpiece of his policies when he's been governor. It's just not something that's been a highlight. And he's made, where he refused to discuss same-sex marriage for a period last summer. That was a little bit bizarre, but I've mentioned before, it's just pragmatic politics. It wasn't a major issue here, but social conservatives feel that he should have stepped up and made his position clear at that time. So he's being asked, why did you do that? Could you explain why you did that, and so forth? And the response from both the social conservatives and from members of Congress is that he's done well in these meetings in terms of explaining. And there was an abortion ad as well that he's been asked about, and his response apparently was that he was trying to co-opt pro-choice rhetoric and use it in a pro-life to support a pro-life bill, and people seem to like that answer.
And he doesn't need to be the most, he doesn't need to be a perfect candidate for social conservatives. He needs to be an acceptable candidate who they think can win.
Yeah, well, let me ask you, Craig, too. You wrote earlier this week about the PAC that has been formed to support Governor Walker's candidacy and sort of this $1 million level and all the support. And tell us about what it takes to meet the governor these days.
Well, it's always kind of shocking to see these things laid out in black and white, but it's essentially the attendance. It wasn't a fundraiser, but the attendance at this reception where the governor appeared. The reception was sponsored by the pro-Walker Unintimidated PAC. It's a super PAC that can accept unlimited contributions and then work on the governor's behalf. They were handed a sheet of paper that laid out, it was like a menu with prices. If you give $1 million, you get this many briefings and you can go to this many events. If you give $500,000, here's what you get. If you give $250,000, here's what you get. So, it's kind of blatant. On the other hand, I don't think people are necessarily giving the governor $1 million because they get a couple of briefings a year and a pin. They're giving it obviously because they want this guy to win, and because they also know that if they give $1 million and he does win, they have an entree with that person.
Maybe they should switch the name from unintimidated to unlimited or something like that. But the situation shows is just how ridiculous the limits are in campaign contributions. People are worrying about the donations, whether you give $5,000 or $2,500 or whatever, but you can circumvent the whole process and give $1 million to this PAC, and you get access to the governor that you wouldn't get otherwise.
For intimidating amounts of money.
Yeah, well, we did a survey before the show, and we have among us here in the studio, I think $17.87. So we're hoping for the pin.
Maybe that's why he's not talking to us much these days.
All right, Dan, you had a story referencing the immigration issue, and that earlier we've talked about the illegal immigration issue and how Walker's changed, and this was a slightly different take.
He also has been talking about immigration. He talked about it in another meeting that he had this week about his rightward shift, and he talked about it again on Fox News. And I did a story because most of the focus has been on poor people from Mexico and whether how many should be allowed in, and should there be a path to citizenship. My story had to do with this program called EB-5 that gives you citizenship or gives you a green card if you give $500,000 to invested in a corporation in the U.S. And he's been a huge supporter of it, and it's not something that he's mentioned in the campaign. So you have with Walker he wants to limit the amount of immigration from certain people, generally the poor people, but at the same time he's very much supportive of legal immigration for the wealthy and affluent.
All right, in the remaining few minutes, we're going to go to some reader questions, and I want to start with one start with Mary on this one. This is from a reader named Zena, who said, "I'm surprised Walker signed the 70-mile-per-hour speed limit bill. He's never here anymore to drive on our roads. Why does this get done, but not the important stuff?" So this kind of goes. Are people getting frustrated with that? That things, what's the priority list in Madison?
I think that bill actually kind of hit a dead end a couple years ago because
Yeah, we're going to get as many road-related cliches into the next 2 minutes as
got
we can.
that one in there.
Okay.
But yeah, so that one, right. But
U-turn.
and it was criticized a couple years ago because it looked like it was going to pass, and there were all these other things that weren't getting passed. And I think it came up again. It's not really a very high controversy thing, and it was actually something that
Robin Voss likes this bill, and he's wanted this. And again, since there's somewhat of a vacuum of power with Walker not here, some of these people can pursue their own issues. So why are they doing this? Because Robin Voss wants it, and there's no one who's going to stop him.
Maybe he'll get bail bonds this year too. Who knows?
All right. This next question is, and we'll throw it to Craig first. It's from the reader's name is Tired of Politics, which so you might be on the wrong show. We do have a Packers podcast we can recommend. But his question or her question is really, what is Russ Feingold's rationale for running again? He had 18 years and voters rejected him. Won't voters see through all of that? Craig, what do you think? Is that a impediment for Russ Feingold that he's had the defeat hung on him and people rejected him once?
Well, you'd think it would be, but I think for a guy who lost in his last election, he's about as well positioned as he could possibly be. I mean, he had a long history before 2010 of winning independents. It didn't happen in 2010, but even in the polling that was done immediately after the 2010 election, his personal numbers weren't bad at all, and they're very good in the recent polling. So I think it's an open question. It's very hard to win back a seat that you've lost. That's why it's such a rare thing. But I think he's generally regarded as a favorite now for this seat, partly because of the vulnerabilities of Senator Johnson, partly because he's running in a presidential cycle, which is always good for Wisconsin Democrats, and partly because I think there's a sense in the polling that despite his loss, it wasn't an outright personal repudiation.
So, Craig, I'm interested in one thing from the Marquette poll on Johnson and Feingold, and that is, in the last Marquette poll, it showed about 30% of Republicans didn't have enough information to say whether they thought they approved or disapproved of Ron Johnson's performance. Right. What is the deal with that?
The deal with that is that hasn't had as high a profile as he should have. I think it's a combination of his personal style. He's been on cable a lot. He's been in the national media a lot, and he's also kind of morphed into more of a national security senator as much as anything. But I think, particularly earlier in his term, I don't think he did all the things he needed to be doing back home to enhance his presence and to reach out to people. I think he's trying to do more of that now.
I get the sense that he likes Washington. He ran as someone who was running against Washington last time, but I get the sense that he likes being on the cable shows. He likes his house there. He, enjoys the U.S. Senate.
Well, I think he likes, he likes to speak, having a platform. He's got very strong opinions. He's got a point of view. I think he likes being heard. He's taken to the sort of public part of the job much more than some people expected. But how much that translates into, a re-election success is another question.
But here he's talking primarily, it seems, to ideological media, not so much to mainstream media or to the general public.
Yeah, I asked him that question when I talked to him last week after Feingold's announcement. I asked him whether he thought he was doing everything he could to communicate his views to people, and he defended himself quite vehemently. He did mention all the time he spent on talk radio and on cable, but he said that he's doing everything he can to deliver his message to people. He admitted that it's kind of a dark message at times, because most of what he has to say has to do with the big kind of it's kind of a gloom and doom message, to the extent that he's out there telling people time and time again about the sort of entitlement
which is what Scott Walker said about him, that he's not Mr. Sunshine.
Yeah. He said he's done how many PowerPoints about the national debt to people? I've lost count.
We'll try to get that count for everybody by next week, because we're just about out of time here. So that's it for this week. Thanks to our viewers for joining us. If you can't wait until next week and you want to rehear this one, you can subscribe to our audio version of the show in the iTunes store. So see you next week.